I think in a way, we all know that development actors operate in conflict-affected countries, and clearly, hopefully, as I've explained, transitional justice activities and demands are now quite prevalent in pretty much every conflict-affected environment that we can think about. So in a sense, it's inevitable. It's sort of the way that DFID used to have to articulate how it was going to deal with conflict, right? The idea of, well, you can work in it, on it, or around it, right? And in a sense, I think development actors have faced exactly the sort of same situation vis-a-vis transitional justice activities. They're going to be going on all around them. So the question is, are you actually running some of them? Are you working adjacent to some of them? How does it affect your work? And in fact, I think you see a number of things. First of all, these days it is oftentimes the same sets of actors, right? So it's the UN, specifically UNDP, in many situations, engaged in support to many of these activities. For example, some of the support to rule of law promotion and development, but also the support to national human rights commissions, and also the support to things like commissions of inquiry. The EU, which, for example, was involved in a massive way in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo in rebuilding the domestic criminal justice system in order to enable the possibility of domestic trials for war crimes. DFID, which, for example, in Sierra Leone, has been heavily engaged for a very long time in support to outreach of the special court, but now increasingly to community mediation projects and to a variety of legal aid programs, all of which are both looking back to what the deprivations were that generated the original violations, but also oftentimes have to engage with abuses of the past. And then international financial institutions. For those of you who read the last World Bank World Development Report, you will have noticed that it was littered with concerns about transitions from conflict. It was heavily conflict-focused, as we all know, but it was actually also heavily focused on how you actually rebuild communities and reconstruct communities, including around issues of criminal justice. So you have the same sets of actors, but you also have these overlapping sets of activities, as I've said: rule of law, judicial and security sector reform. We've also seen this push to suggest that perhaps one ought to serve the other. So either that development activities should be more explicitly oriented towards dealing with transitional justice activities. So don't just engage in your support to governance activities, UNDP, but think about how this actually relates to past abuses. And in fact, these things are oftentimes quite difficult to disaggregate anyway, because countries with a long history of impunity for serious physical human rights abuses oftentimes also have very serious corruption problems and very long-standing histories of impunity for economic crimes, right? And then similarly, you see arguments that transitional justice activities should actually be serving development goals. For very much similar reasons, right? That in fact, transitional justice activities shouldn't be focused narrowly just on past physical harms, but in fact on the whole scope of impunity within a country, which would include dealing with economic crimes. So, for example, and to come back to Kenya one last time, one of the reasons that there was such interest in having actually the ICC engage in prosecutions, even though it can't touch a variety of past economic crimes, was the sense that there was sort of permanent impunity for all forms of elite abuse, right? So there have been a whole series of commissions of inquiry over the past sort of 20 years dealing with land grabs, dealing with massive economic corruption, none of which ever actually had their recommendations implemented. So the hope was that there would be this sort of symbolic effect, and that it might actually force a reconsideration of much wider problems of corruption and lack of rule of law domestically. But as I've noted, to date, there really is a general exclusion in transitional justice mechanisms of serious economic measures or promotion of economic rights, with the exception of reparations measures, right, which are usually targeted to very specific individual victims or individual communities.